Yes. It's the Alison Arngrim Show, and I'm Alison Arngrim. Okay, well, some of you may remember me as Evil Nellie Olson, but tonight I'm Alison Arngrim, and it's the Alison Arngrim Show. And here on the Alison Arngrim Show, we talk about things that make you feel good, the movies and the television shows that made us feel good, and the people who made them, and people who are doing things now to make the world a better and more interesting place. And oh, this is a good one. Okay. This is, if you're one of my truly bonnet head fans out there who's really into the prairie, you are going to love tonight. This is where the whole intersection of librarians and hardcore history nerds and acting collide. Because, you know, if you're a hardcore prairie fan, we have the people who really love the show. And then we have the people who really, really love the books and even look askance at the show. And then we have the people who are into the real history, the real Laura Ingalls Wilder, who even look down on the books. Well, this is where it all comes together. This is incredible. There's a thing called Historic Voices. And they have now launched the First Ladies Forum. So hello, it's Women's History Month. So I have two of the women from this. And I should warn you, speaking as Nellie, I'm a little concerned because I'm surrounded by Lauras tonight. I have with me from the First Ladies Forum. Yes, that's right. They recreate the lives and personalities of several of our amazing, incredible First Ladies of our country. I have with me Laura Keyes, who often does Mary Todd Lincoln, and Laura just came from being Laura Ingalls Wilder earlier today. Hello.
Thank you.
And next to her is the fabulous Laura Rocklyn, known for her recreation of Louisa Catherine Adams, as well as occasionally sneaking out to do Charlotte Bronte. Laura Rocklyn.
Hello.
This is fascinating. Okay, so Bill Anderson, who is one of the foremost historians on Laura Ingalls Wilder and a great friend of mine, has written many, many books about Laura, turned me on to this. Said, do you know Laura Keyes? Do you know about this historic project, the whole voices, the historic voices? They have this First Ladies Forum. They're doing like these recreations, like these people who come in and say, well, I'm Laura Ingalls Wilder, blah, blah. But they're doing all of these famous women. They're doing the First Ladies. They're doing all this. You've got to talk to them. And then I went to the website and went, bananas. And here you both are. Welcome to the Alison Arngrim Show.
Thank you very much, Allison.
Now, Laura Keyes, you literally just came from being Laura Ingalls Wilder earlier.
Yes, I did. As I mentioned earlier, March can be a very busy month. You reminded us all that it's Women's History Month. And so while it's, I look forward to this opportunity to share all these things with you. I couldn't break a previous commitment. Yes, I just did, with the wonders of Zoom, I just completed a portrayal of Laura Ingalls Wilder. This one was set in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic, and sharing some insights and advice to her daughter Rose, a kind of imagined letter that I imagined her writing to her daughter Rose. And so I just finished that and decided to join you.
That's brilliant, because 1918, because currently, you know, I've been reading the Little House books. I read the whole Little House books from Big Woods through Happy Golden Years. And currently, I'm reading Little House in the Ozarks, which is a collection of articles that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote for the newspaper, like the Missouri Ruralist and the farm papers, in 1916, 1917, 1918, talking about World War I, the Great War, and talking about the terrible pandemic and the Spanish flu, and talking about, and she even, some of the mentions, I was just in San Francisco visiting my daughter, and it's all there. It's all there. So we've been reading this. So this is fantastic. You just did one from 1918.
Yes. Again, this was a presentation that I wrote myself based on her writings, based on the letters that exist. And sometimes, I mean, many of the letters that I pull from were actually written at many years later to Rose, but for the sake of everything, I decided to put them together and set them at this time. And again, through the wonders of Zoom, I just finished a program for a public library. and now I'm then you can have a whole nother conversation,
Now,
and that's something, yeah, that we really enjoyed here, these other first ladies and me.
so now you are originally a librarian, am I correct? Yes.
Yes, I am currently a library director in Central Illinois, my day job.
Library. So you're a librarian, but where do you do these presentations where you completely in costume and in person reenact all of these different women? Where do you typically do these?
I am usually hired by public libraries, though of course museums, and occasionally schools, though schools don't always have such a large budget in the last, 8 years or something. But I've been portraying women from history, starting with Mary Lincoln since 2008. And oh yes, there I am. And living in Illinois, I've lived in Illinois my whole life. Everyone's really interested in Mary Lincoln in Illinois, though of course I've traveled not quite all over the nation. I can't claim to that, but I've done a couple different tours in New England for a week, and then come back to the Midwest. And so I do them kind of wherever I'm asked. And now with Zoom, I really have added even more states to my repertoire, and a group in London, England, and that was great.
Well, and the same things happened to me. I mean, when things closed down, I had several stand-up appearances and personal appearances, and they were canceled. And suddenly I went, "Oh, look, hello! Now I'm doing them here." And so the show went here, and I actually did my stand-up act in my living room. Over that side of the room, I have I have a whole backdrop, and so I do that. And I did do a presentation to a group in Ireland who were going to fly me out, but instead we did it right here. So yes, this is what we're all doing now. Laura Rocklyn, you're also technically a librarian, aren't you?
My background is less in library sciences and more in theater and English literature. I started out, I guess, the first 15 years of my career essentially working as a classical actress and a teaching artist for various Shakespeare companies in the Washington, D.C. area, which was really exciting and a wonderful way to get into theater and how you can share and explore history through theater and bring it to life in that way, which was very exciting and I really loved doing.
Now, I've noticed in the resumes, I'm seeing a background with some Shakespearean stuff, but everyone seems to have a Shakespeare background, a degree or a certificate in extensive Shakespearean theater experience. Is there like a big tie-in there for people who do this kind of historical work?
Well, it's wonderful training because in both cases, essentially, I mean, except for I guess Jackie Kennedy is the only one of our first ladies who's, in the 20th century. But we're working with heightened language. And so having that Shakespeare background is really helpful for looking at these letters and diaries and a lot of the primary source material that we adapt for our programs, but making them sound natural and organic and like they're actually coming from our hearts and souls. So I think having that classical training is really important for making living history performances come alive and not sound stodgy and stuffy, but as though the thoughts we're having in the moment, which is why you do the living history, is to make these people living and breathing humans, not names in a textbook.
That makes sense too, because I know in reading the Little House books, there's a mention of Caroline reading Middlemarch at the dinner table. And so I thought, oh, maybe I could do Middlemarch for one of my Facebook readings. And I sat down to read Middlemarch and went, yeah, this probably isn't going to go over that well on Facebook Live. It's really interesting. But I went, oh, I forgot. That's right. Books that were written in the 1800s sound different to the modern ear. And I'm like, yes, you can sit down and read it, but to the modern ear, it's going to be jarring for a lot of people. And I thought, well, a good thing I read all these old books in my day, so I understood. But it just sounds different. And I can see where that training will work, because our tendency is to make anyone from not our century sound, well, they should all have British accents like in the movies. They should all be different. I mean, when people try to do Shakespeare, it's like, well, actually they were real people, so you could just like talk kind of normally. And that's very hard to do when it's language that is not familiar to a person. So I can see now where that would absolutely be a huge tie-in there. Laura Rocklyn, what's prompted you to get into this facet of acting, the historical recreation?
Well, I think, along with my performing work, I started getting increasingly interested in dramaturgy. So I would be the person sort of behind the scenes of the show as well, doing the historical research, doing what they called period movement workshops with the actors, and talking to them. I did one production of Anne of the Thousand Days, so about Anne Boleyn, and how as a woman do you move in this clothing? How would you present yourself in Henry VIII's court? And I found the research behind that really fascinating. And there were a lot of historical women I was reading books about whom I could not find any plays. And I thought, well, perhaps something interesting I can do then is sort of write these programs and bring them to life. So that was sort of the way that I began to transition in. And then I was fortunate that a library up in Maine actually asked me to develop a program for them for one summer and I suggested Jane Austen as one of my favorite authors. And they said, that's great. And that was my first one, I guess, about 10 or 12 years ago now.
Wow. And you mentioned the movement, and that's something I've noticed it does. And actually, even on Little House, where, thank heavens, as we were talking earlier about the dresses and the hoops, we didn't have hoop skirts. We did not have hoop skirts. It was the 1870s. We did not have hoop skirts. And we were in Minnesota. So we also got the fashions like 10 years after they got them in New York and Paris, even though Nellie said, oh, my clothes are from Paris. No, you were in Minnesota. The movement, just the petticoats and the things, obviously, and we were a bunch of actresses living in the 1970s in California, so we were wearing jeans most of the time and switching to these clothes. The drastic change in how we walked and ran and moved and sat was just like mind-blowing, and even, for the grown-ups. And for me, absolutely, once I was in the costume and the wig, it was like, oh, I'm someone else. And so I've had that experience to some extent. And Laura Keyes, we were talking about the thing about the dresses, that people are obsessed with the dresses being pretty. And you actually had an issue with this with the Laura Mary Todd problem.
Yes, it did happen once where a small public library had contacted me, wanted me to portray Laura Ingalls Wilder. We agreed on a date and a time. Everything was great. So I drive there. I always, and this was of course pre-COVID, this was a while ago. I arrived an hour early and went to walk in the library to introduce myself to the librarian, and I saw a nice poster right on the door of the library announcing the program, Laura Ingalls Wilder tonight, and it had a picture of me in costume. Possibly that picture of me as in a hoop skirt, and I think it was one of my ball gowns, which are made out of silk. And I found the librarian and I said, "Is that the flyer that you were using?" I was trying to super politely find a way to say, what were you thinking? That's not right. And I found some way to ask her, like, why did you choose that photo of all the photos that I sent you?
Oh,
and her answer was, oh, it's such a pretty dress. We wanted you in a pretty dress. And the historic costume, which is something that I know Laura Rocklyn and the other members of our First Ladies Forum, we take historic costume very seriously. And so I was a little bit put off because I didn't want to be represented as someone who threw on a hoop skirt and called themselves Laura Ingalls Wilder, because that is very incorrect. As you just described, Alison, different era, different decade, very much
Not
so.
even close.
Yeah. So the not only the research, which Laura and I have touched on, but the research into our costume and the various layers of costume. As when I portray Mary Lincoln, I'm wearing 3 layers of underclothing before I even reach the outer clothing. And I'm sure Laura Rocklyn could talk about the costume that she wears, which is a very different era than the hoop skirt.
Yes, and I mean, I have the challenge with Louisa that the program essentially starts, around the 1790s, which is the portrait you're seeing now in one of my favorite gowns of hers, and goes through to John Quincy Adams' inauguration in 1825. So I have to have a base costume that can go from an era when you had a very small waist and a very large skirt, through an era when you have a very high empire waist and a very narrow skirt, and then get to the 1820s where suddenly you have epic puff sleeves. And so it's fascinating in that program to trace the fashion history and also the politics that's behind the reasons the fashions are changing. And that's one of the things I love about portraying a woman, is that the fashions changed so rapidly, but for such specific political reasons that are often overlooked. And I think that's a really exciting thing, especially at the beginning of the 19th century.
See, that's a huge thing. I mean, we look at men's suits. I mean, that's something that in fashion people said. Generally, most men with minor adjustments have been wearing the same suit for a couple of hundred years. It's got pants, it's got a jacket, it has lapels. They get bigger and smaller. We women have worn just complete, like, different planets of clothes. And that's something I've always wondered historically. I know how it affected me for just 8 hours a day, having to wear the petticoats, like, for instance, hi, it's time to use the bathroom. Just like the complete radical change to my existence for 9 hours. So the effect that it would have on women's day-to-day lives wearing these different outfits is drastically different. And as you said, for political reasons, I know for economic reasons, like we look at fashions from the 30s and 40s, oh, there's a depression, oh, there's a war. But what kind of fabric do we have a lot of? This altered how people dress. What would be the political reasons with the shift from hoop skirts to not hoop skirts to narrow in that time period that caused women to have to dress so differently?
So for Louise's lifetime, the big catalyst is actually the American and French revolutions, because you're having this shift to this focus on Greece and Rome and the classical world and returning to this Republican idea. So you're rapidly moving from these very elaborate gowns that we associate sort of with Versailles and to a lesser extent sort of colonial America, to these gowns that essentially are trying to look like Grecian garments. And if you go and look at statues in a museum like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston or the Met in New York from the Greco-Roman period, they have the very high empire waists, like you sort of associate with a Jane Austen movie. But then as those movements go out of fashion, when the French Revolution becomes more violent than many people agree with, and we're starting to rethink the world once again, those fashions start to get left behind. And the 1820s arrive, which is just wonderful extravagance. And by the 1830s, as I mentioned, the crazy sleeves, and you will never see anything quite like the piled up amounts of hair, ribbons, feathers, even birds in 1830s hairstyles.
So it was a boom time. Was it like a roaring 20s boom time for people?
Essentially. And I mean, I think your life was almost as crazy because it's also that decade sort of right before Queen Victoria comes to the throne in 1837, where things were getting really wild and crazy. And then she comes to the throne and calms things down again, to a certain extent.
Now, this program, Historic Voices, this is sort of the banner that the First Lady's thing is under. Historic Voices, do they do more than this program? And how long has this thing been going on?
So Historic Voices is the company that I started, you know, the presentations that I do. And I also include my husband in that. My husband portrays one of his ancestors who was a Southern abolitionist minister in North Carolina in the 1850s. And so that's who my husband portrays. And so Historic Voices is my company. But having met Laura Rocklyn through Zoom, I saw her portrayal actually of Louisa Catherine Adams, and our colleague Judith Calaora, who Laura was already friends with. I saw some of Judith's presentations again through Zoom, because even though we're starting this venture, yes, even though we're starting this venture together, we have still never met in person. And then I was already acquainted with the fourth member of our group, Leslie Goddard, who lives in Chicago, in the Chicagoland area. So I brought all of these women together, the four of us, and I just said, well, we all portray a first lady. What would happen if we just started, if we banded together and then started promoting ourselves as a series? It's not, I mean, each individual presentation I truly think is excellent in and of itself, but taking them as a series, one after the other, not only are you learning about these four individual women, but you're actually learning about the changing role of the First Lady throughout
Well,
time.
you cover a lot of ground. I mean, I'm seeing a program, Chit Chat with Dolly Madison, and then The Adventures of Louisa Catherine Adams, then Mrs. Lincoln in Love, and then Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy is suddenly in this way. Wait, Jackie Kennedy? Well,
Yeah.
And so we're going from hoop skirts to everything to suddenly pillbox hats and Jackie Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Wait, what? And you're covering all of this historical ground, but from the perspective of the women who were
Yes.
there and were as opposed to just the usual history that we've been listening to for however long. I'm loving this. Do you ever do things where well, I mean, obviously at Zoom, we're you do a panel of like all of the first ladies that you have?
We wouldn't rule that out in the future. We haven't done that yet. I will say, because I've known Leslie Goddard for a couple years now, and again, we both live in the same state. About 4 years ago or 5, she and I actually co-wrote a short play, and it's a play where Mary Lincoln meets Jackie Kennedy, and they have a very interesting conversation.
That's that whole Lincoln Kennedy, when people try to do the
Exactly.
coincidences and tie-ins of the assassination, to have the two women meet. That
Yeah, unfortunately, we have not been able to successfully translate that to Zoom or virtual. And so that's something that we're just going to have to wait until we're in the same room at the same time, and then we can give that program. But yes, something like what you just described, a panel of all of these ladies answering questions or discussing a topic, that could definitely be something in the future that we do.
And your piece is, of course, Mrs. Lincoln in Love, which we don't think. Now, Mary Todd Lincoln is one of these women in history. I mean, talk about getting a bad rap. For years, it's always been any movies or television movies, big portrayals of Mary Todd Lincoln, that she was just a humorless battle axe, just mean, terrible woman. And then she's crazy was the huge thing later. Well, Mary Todd Lincoln, she was crazy, And then as people understand this, well, maybe she was depressed. And now, of course, I'm reading this stuff they didn't want to give her back her clothes after he's assassinated. She's like, excuse me, what? That's her stuff. And how horribly she was treated by people. And you kind of go, oh, maybe she was just really angry. Maybe that happened. And there's now been some production. I saw actually production in Missouri. And it's a guy I'm going to introduce you to who has an event in Missouri. You certainly shocked us, because he's done several things on Mary Todd Lincoln. The sort of redeeming the real Mary Todd Lincoln. She has gotten so much bad press and so many terrible portrayals in literature and film. And here you have this right out called Mrs. Lincoln in Love, and then the story that any of us were raised with love. So fill us in on this change in our picture of Mary Todd Lincoln.
Yes, I was very happy to when this program came together, because I definitely wanted to show. It's hard to say a different side of her, but I guess that's what I have to say, because as you just described, in pop culture, in American pop culture, she definitely has a bad rap. And that is so deep-seated. That started, when she was in the White House. It is so many years entrenched that it will take us twice as many years in order to get that away from her personality, her memory. And so this presentation that I put together, I do look at some of the only existing letters that have survived between Abraham and Mary Lincoln, which were written when they were not in the White House, when in the very late 1840s, when he was a congressman, and a representative from the state of Illinois. And so they were very sweet letters that they wrote back and forth to each other when they were separated. I also talk about the love that she has for her children. In the presentations that I do, I always set them at a very specific moment, a very specific day in history. And so that's something that I do. And Laura Rocklyn mentioned earlier that she chose to do that for her Louisa Catherine Adams. She said it on the day of John Quincy Adams' inauguration. that really helps to say, okay, this moment in history, this person knows all this information, but they don't know what's happening next. And so I have included a lot of information about her love for her sons. I just touch on the fact that she had a lot of deep love and connection for her siblings and her half siblings. And of course, very soon after the Civil War started, many of those half siblings vocally, publicly joined the Confederacy and turned her back on her. That's hard. That's practically like the death of someone. It's the death of a relationship. And so I touch on that too, that she has this love that is difficult to deal with at this time because these people in her mind have also betrayed her.
And you would think she would get a sympathetic betrayal. Her husband was very popular, Abraham Lincoln. We all love Abraham Lincoln. Everybody, hey, Abraham Lincoln. And he's assassinated. This woman is widowed. Her husband is murdered in front of her. She would be getting a sympathetic betrayal. But no. Do you think, and I'm just, that fact that Abraham Lincoln was one of the first presidents to speak for civil rights and the freeing of the slaves, that the hostility of certain persons who didn't want the slaves freed or any of that to happen, that they were taking this out on Mary Todd, because it's easier to take it out on a surviving woman anyway, that a lot of this flack she was getting were from people who were anti-Abraham Lincoln and anti-abolition.
That's possible. Mary Lincoln did not vocalize her political views, even though we know from her friends and from letters that do exist that she gave money and her time to help runaway slaves, to help newly freed slaves, all of those individuals, those former enslaved people, she helped them, but she did not. She didn't have a PR manager. She didn't have someone saying, oh, yes, reporters, come along and look at all the good work that she does, as many politicians and or spouses of politicians do now.
There's no TV taking her on a tour of the Rose Garden because, hello, hi, yes.
Very true. So it's very hard to say if some of the hostility that you're describing, that we all remember, had to do with Abraham Lincoln's position on what we would call civil rights. It more had to do with the animosity that started as soon as they came into the White House. And that was because when they came into the White House, she was used to being her husband's political partner. And I say political partner, we still do not know to what extent she assisted Abraham. There are some scholars who will claim that she wrote his speeches for him. There are other scholars who claim she was just a sounding board, as so many wives of husbands are. We do not know the answer. The answer is somewhere in between those two statements. But the bottom line was she was used to discussing political ideas and topics pretty openly with Abraham. And so as soon as he stepped foot in the executive mansion, as she called it during her time, that all stopped. He didn't have time for her opinion. No one around him wanted her opinion. She was told, go host a tea party. And
that would be sort of ahead of her time, being an equal in the relationship and a sounding board, having these conversations, which back then would be pretty far. And I wonder how many women in the 1800s and 1700s were actually equals in their relationship and having conversations privately with their husbands where they're actually being respected as an equal and sounding off opinions, but when they left the house had to be, come along, dear, and treated as if they were a proper wife at the time. So yes, once in the White House where they were public, he couldn't say, well, I discussed this with my wife and she thinks we should do this. People would have had a fit. So she was suppressed upon his election then.
Yes. And so that's something that, again, I don't dwell on because I do make my presentation a little bit on the cheerful side, but it's something that I do touch on. And I would say that Laura Rocklyn touches on that as well. Through her, I have learned so much about Louisa Catherine Adams and her role with John Quincy Adams.
I noticed is the thing is the date's March 4th, 1825, and she has not accompanied her husband to his inauguration. that would be scandalous now. If a president's wife said, yeah, that's fine, not going. So at that time, that had to have been a huge deal. So why didn't she go, and what happened?
And this is one of the questions that no historians have quite agreed on as yet. I mean, one thing that we know from Louisa's diaries, and she did have challenging health. I mean, it's possible that over the course of her marriage, she had as many as 11 miscarriages.
Oh,
so her health was very delicate. She had been through a lot. And she does write that the night before the inauguration, she did not sleep well, that she had a terrible headache. The other side of that coin is that, as Laura Keyes was describing, one of the similarities we're finding among these first ladies is that Louisa was John Quincy's right-hand woman throughout his presidential campaign. Unlike many first ladies, she was actually raised and trained to be a political hostess because her father was the American consul in London, and she was brought up to run a political salon, essentially. So she had always been sort of his campaign manager. He became elected, was suddenly surrounded by a cabinet and advisors, and she was essentially told once again, it's time for you to step back, fold your hands, and do your needlework. So the question is, how much was she actually ill? And how much was she sort of making a statement, I would come and stand behind you, I will come and stand next to you, but I won't come and stand behind you. And we don't know. So the thesis of my show is that it's Louisa wrestling with, do I want to go or do I not want to go, and why? And that's what causes her to look back over their relationship and how invaluable she was to him. And, in all of the diplomatic posts he held in Europe, she was an essential asset because she spoke French perfectly as well as English. She played the harp beautifully. She sang exquisitely. She was an amazing dancer. So in any European court, she was the best asset to have on his arm possible. But suddenly in America, those skills were not quite as valuable and even looked down upon a bit because they thought it made her a little bit too high society and not enough of a Republican woman.
It was sort of an anti-intellectual bent at that time. I know we've gone through that in America in the 50s. It was like, you weren't supposed to be too smart, especially women. Oh, you're bookish. Don't be bookish. Was that also a thing at the time, not only for women? There was sort of the anti-intellectual elitist look that they didn't like that.
Yes, there was a thought about, if a lady were too much of what they called a blue stocking, it was a little bit shocking. But the other problem with Louisa was that, we were within a few decades of the revolution, and she did have an English mother and had been brought up in London. And I'm afraid when John Quincy first wrote home and told his mother, Abigail Adams, that he was engaged, she wrote back and said, well, for the sake of our country, I hope that your new wife is at least half blood, meaning at least half American, because she was afraid that his marrying an English woman would end his political career. So Louisa was always very self-conscious about being at once proud of her father, who was the American consul in London and was a proud patriot, but being a little embarrassed that she had been raised in Europe, and trying to find the balance between using her accomplishments but not overdoing it.
Well, I can see why she didn't want to go. I mean, I said this when I was doing Little House, people would say, do you want to live in that era? And I always said, no. One, I like air conditioning and antibiotics. So, I like the modern conveniences in medicine. But when I read how women had to exist and the hoops they had to jump through and the things they had to pretend, I'll just pretend I'm not doing the thing that I've been doing. If I had been in these women, I would have thrown up all the time. I would have had to call in sick because it would have made me barf. I would not have known what to do. It would have given me so much anxiety if I had been told, no, now you have to pretend that you don't know any of these things. I would have gone mad. And I've always been very relieved that I was born much later. And even, as I said, even in the Laura Ingalls era that I got to help portray, I thought, man, this is rough. I don't want to be doing this. So this has to be quite the interesting thing, especially when you go through time periods, because you talk about both of you play women from different time periods as well. Laura Rocklyn, you said you kind of stick to one century, a 100-year period.
is I find that, my interest, for whatever reason, sort of falls between 1770 and 1870. But I think there are so many fascinating changes happening in there, because we do go through sort of the era of revolutions in terms of the American, the French, then you hit 1848 and the revolution wave that sweeps Europe, but also the Industrial Revolution is happening. So life is really changing on the ground. Part of the reason the way people dress is changing is that the way that cloth is manufactured is changing. All of these different things are happening. And I think in the world we live in now, with such rapid technological changes, in some ways it's reassuring to look back at an earlier time period where people felt just as unmoored and just as much as though the rug is being pulled out from under them. But we look back now and think, oh, how quaint, all that technology is so simple. So, you wonder if 100 or 200 years from now, people look back at us and think, oh, it's fine, what were they worried about? But it's interesting to see how people adjust.
Well, you see also things repeat. I mean, one of the reasons when you look at, Laura Ingalls Wilder, so she's living in the 1870s, and that right around 1874 to 75, there was a recession. Times got hard. So it wasn't just like, oh, the Ingalls. No, they weren't living that way because everyone was living under those circumstances. They were living under those circumstances because times were awful financially, and they were really poor. Because gradually, as the books go on, she starts to talk about their friends and neighbors, and you go, oh, look, wait, they're not starving. And there's a difference. And then things change. They're in Desmet. It's years later, and suddenly you're going, are the Ingalls rich? What happened? Well, things got a bit better. Things improved. They moved to a bigger town. And there's that change. Well, when the books came out, it was the height of the Depression. When she wrote the books, they came out in the 1930s, and people were dealing with depression. And when we think of the 30s, we think, oh, quaint, fabulous old times. When our grandmothers were, well, people in the 30s said, people are buying canned goods in these refrigerators. My grandmother did all her own canning, and she didn't have a refrigerator. So suddenly this woman puts out these fabulous children's books, these beautiful memories of how we cooked and prepared food. And it was nostalgia for the 1800s, for people for the 30s. And again, people were having a horrible time financially in the recession of the 1870s for the people going through the depression of the 30s. And then what did we do? We made a TV show that came out in 1974. At the height of the 1970s recession, when gasoline was rationed and you couldn't get meat in the supermarket, and it was a hit. So I've seen these things do repeat. Mm-hmm. And have you noticed that in the women you're portraying, where, okay, well, this one's from 18, et cetera, this was 17, but that was the year that the terrible thing happened that is almost exactly this, identical circumstances.
I'll let you take that, Laura, since you portray one of our first women.
Well, and I'd love to hear your comments on it as well. But I will say, one of the first Zoom events I did after everything shut down because of the pandemic was our colleague Judith Calaora, who portrays Dolly Madison for First Ladies Forum. She and I did a program where she portrayed Rachel Revere and I portrayed Abigail Adams. And we were talking about the smallpox epidemic of 1775 and the work going on in Boston to inoculate the population. And that was a wonderful way, honestly, for me to cope with the beginning of the pandemic and figure out what's happening, was to go back and read all of Abigail Adams' letters and diaries and see how they got through it. And I mean, it was fascinating. It made me so grateful because John Adams talks in detail about the process of being inoculated against smallpox by Joseph Warren.
Wow.
And it's so more unpleasant than anything we have to deal with getting a shot in our arm. So it made me very grateful.
When I think of it, and Revere, I'm just going, wait, when did we ever hear of anybody from Paul Revere's life? Ever. I was like Paul Revere, like he was this one guy all by, like, he live alone. There's like no discussion of Mrs. Revere or any of this. And so, hello, I'd like to go to that presentation and hear that. So many of these women sort of disappear. We hear the first ladies because they wore beautiful dresses and and a few of them stood out, but we don't really hear in depth about them. We don't. There's pictures. It's like, oh, Dolly meant the first ladies, but this is much more in depth about these women's lives and accomplishments.
You're absolutely right. And something that I have always, I have strived to do since I started portraying Mary Lincoln in 2008 was to portray her as a human being. Was to portray her as, and I don't always even like the phrase as a real person, because of course she was a real person. I usually use the phrase as a human being, because even with, if we could quickly compare Mary Lincoln to Louisa Catherine Adams, there are many books about Mary Lincoln, scholarly books, kids' picture books, many books about Mary Lincoln. Some of them are accurate, some of them aren't. But the bottom line is, by doing a living history presentation, and especially when we're able to do it, face to face, the people of any age can see me portraying Mary Lincoln, and I do my absolute best to portray her as a human person. And human does not mean benevolent. She's a wonderful saint that we should all aspire to. She's not. Oh, goodness, she was not. And so in my presentations, of course, I don't dwell on it, but I particularly give a couple sentences or give a couple, comments that are completely true about how she might have, insulted someone in a letter, or kind of gossiped behind someone's back or something like that, because she was human and she did things like that. And
the one production I ever saw that was about Mary Todd Lincoln, the letters and real things, she talked about the clothes that after he's assassinated and she's no longer first lady, she's like, what do I do for a living? I was supported by, I don't have a job. Where do I live? You're telling me, oh, well, he's off you go. Am I not to be provided with any housing or stipend? And my dresses, oh, well, these are the first lady dresses. They go in the museum. I'm wearing those. And that they took her clothes. They took a lot of her stuff that she had been told she would keep, that were her personal possessions and things to wear. And that she was basically being told that to just kind of leave with nothing after she had done nothing wrong.
There was definite confusion after Abraham's death. Again, he was the first president assassinated, and they were still dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War. The Civil War was far from over. And even though Lee had surrendered, that didn't mean the war was over. And so there was a lot of confusion over just what do they do and how soon do they need to be out of the White House, because the Johnson family needs to move in eventually. And a lot of things just did not help. The first thing that did not help is that the first President Johnson didn't really have a first lady. His wife, whom I am embarrassed to say that I've forgotten her Christian name, she was an invalid. She didn't even rise from her sickbed. His daughter, Mrs. Patterson, was often the hostess, did the hostessing things.
The role of that stuff.
But she didn't know what to do. No one knew what to do. And the other thing that a lot of people forget, and at the time and even now, they blame Mary Lincoln for stealing a lot of things, from the White House. And there are two things that I'll say to that. First of all, the servants who were employed in the White House were chaos. There was no butler. If everyone's seen Downton Abbey, those butlers and those,
right.
Those house, there were none of those. Those people had been dismissed. And so the servants, the maids and the footmen, they were carrying off whatever they could carry, and no one was stopping them, because
you just had a huge war, this war that they don't know where it's going to go, and then the president's been killed. They may have said, look, this whole thing's falling apart. I don't know, I'm going to get while the getting is good. I don't know where this is going. I'm going to take what I can carry and run.
Yes. And the other thing, which again, I really do like, that we've included Jackie Kennedy in the First Ladies Forum, is because it wasn't until the Kennedy administration that the White House Historical Society, known by a couple different names, but pretty much the White House Historical Society, was formed. And the White House is now a museum. And so there are very strict rules about if a piece of furniture is purchased either by the presidential family, or it is given as a gift, there are rules on what does that mean? Does the presidential family, are they allowed to take it? Are they not allowed to take it? Does it have to go into storage? None of those rules existed during the Lincoln administration, pretty much up until the Kennedy administration. No rules. And so modern critics and scholars who want to blame Mary Lincoln for stealing things, the answer is she was technically not disobeying any rules, because there weren't any.
Right, and there was some stuff she was like, "This, I came with this. This is
you're absolutely right.
I got here. What are you talking about?" Yeah.
Yes, you're right. There was confusion with that too. Either items or clothing there was just confusion what trunks contained what, and people, accused her of stealing items. They open up the trunk, it's her own personal clothing. Such confusion.
It's horrifying. It's awful. So I love the whole having Mary Todd Lincoln and Jackie Kennedy compare notes. That's just got to be mind blowing. This is fabulous. Now I do have to say, notice that in Laura Rocklyn's resume, you also include that on TV. You've been in Legend and Lies, The Patriots, and Investigation Discovery, Southern Fried Homicide. I have to Southern Fried Homicide. What was this? Because this sounds great.
Yes, indeed. It's a show on the Investigation Discovery Channel that frequently films in Washington, D.C. So it's one of the things, if you are an actor in Washington, D.C., at some point in your career, you're probably going to be on this show. And there are several of them, but in one of them, I played the mother of the murderess. So my role basically just spoil her terribly. So as an adult, she felt entitled to murder people. But I had crazy poofy 50s hair and, a Donna Reed apron, and yes, my job was just to spend several scenes spoiling my daughter.
And Legends and Lies, The Patriots?
So that one was actually a Fox News history program. And, it's another one that was filming in the Virginia area, and they advertised they needed an Abigail Adams. And I thought, well, I don't know that I'll get it, but I'll go out. And luckily it was a good fit. And that one was such fun because we filmed at a living history museum down in North Carolina. So it was sort of complete immersion. You're in the costume in these buildings on this site. And it was a really exciting one to get to do.
This is the ways that this would come up, like, oh, I happen to do Abigail. It's like, how many people can say, no, really, I actually did, that they could audition for that. I find it fascinating. There was the TV crossover. This is amazing. As I said, I go to a lot of these historical events. I'm going to be going to the Cherry Blossom Festival in Marshfield, Missouri. Have either of you been yet?
We neither one of us have been. I have heard many things about it, and so perhaps in the future, yes, this could be a thing.
There's an obsession. The Reverend Inman, who puts it together, is absolutely mad, just obsessed with presidential history. Mm-hmm. And usually has a presidential descendant or several thereof, the Grover Cleveland family, the George Washington family, the Jimmy Carter family. Usually he's trying to get as many as humanly possible in one place, and has historical panels about people's lives, and has done a little bit of theatrical productions discussing the lives of some of the, including even Mary Todd Lincoln. And it's all about history, and then sort of random celebrities like me and people from Little House on the Walls. And it's a wonderful combination, and this is a thing you should be doing. You should be having the First Ladies Forum at the Cherry. I'm just going to come right and say you need to have First Ladies Forum at the Cherry Blossom Festival. So we will absolutely make sure that you get introduced. Now, shockingly, we're actually almost winding down here. I'm amazed this has just gone so fast. Where do people find out about this? Because I did not know about this. If Bill Anderson had not email, our fabulous William Anderson did not say, hey, do you know about this? I would have been completely in the dark and not known about this. And now I'm reading the website. How do people read about what you're doing and get hold of you?
Well, we're on a variety of different social media under First Ladies Forum, and that's the numeral 1ST Ladies Forum on a variety of social media. We also have a website that I hope that I can share with your tech producers, and they will share that. Historic Voices.
There it is. Yes, it's popping up. It's going to go up, and then of course I've been putting it on my Facebook as well when I announced we're doing the show. So yes, of course.
Yes, through our website and through our Facebook, variety of social media. We share not only what we do, and if someone truly is interested, they can send us a message, or we have a detailed frequently asked questions page. How does this work? How much does this cost? Et cetera, et cetera. And so things like that. But we also take the time to share a lot of tidbits of information, the research that we have each done into these ladies. We take the time to share that on our social media as well. I think last week we all shared information about some jewelry that either still exists or that we have, photographs of each of these women. And it's wonderful. Again, I learned so much from these other ladies that are in our group, which I love to do. I just love to learn about history.
And Laura, you're obviously on the same list and everything, and then you also have the Bronte extravaganza on the side there. But that's all. Is that part of this? No, it's not the First Ladies Forum. But is the Bronte show a separate piece?
It is. And if you want to follow me as well, I'm on Twitter and Instagram as Laura Lost in Time. And I post there about all of my other programs for Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, in addition to Louisa Catherine Adams. And if I have other shows or things running, I post about those there as well.
Well, our costumes on Little House were not as authentic as always as everything. I did wear my own underwear to my great relief, although sometimes there was sort of an 1800s little camisole thing under the blouses. And we did actually, no zippers. We did not use zippers, but we did have like a lot of hook and eye and whatnot. I did not have to wear the high button shoes until later. I had the Mary Janes, and then I did have the button shoes. And I did have little hook and eye fasteners, which were difficult. I did get to wear, I said, my own bra and underwear. Yay. And for stockings, we often actually wore tights, except unless we were going to be in a fight or fall down. Then we had the short stockings and the garters and the bloomers. You only got bloomers if you're going to hit the ground and your skirt was going to go up that day. So we weren't 100% authentic, but the petticoats were pretty much dead on, and most of the dresses. And I can say they were exceedingly uncomfortable in California heat. My wig was not historically accurate, but very elaborate and well designed and exceedingly uncomfortable. In our last months, how uncomfortable would you say? What is the most uncomfortable time period of costume you have worn?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I feel lucky with Louisa in that sort of early 19th century is mainly Regency, so it's very comfortable. I'm even in my Regency short stays. But once in a while, I also portray Clover Adams, who is, 1870s, 1880s. And once you get that late Victorian corset, I'm quite used to it, so I now find it quite comfortable. But that's the one that's really altering your shape. So until you've done some waist training and are sort of used to it, it can be more challenging to move in.
And what's the worst one?
I don't know if I have a worst outfit. My portrayals go from about 1846 to, I guess, 1918. Now 1918 is new. And so the vast majority of them are corsets and everything. I can only remember some very uncomfortable days because of an awkward thing. The day that I got a new corset for Mary Lincoln for Civil War era clothing, the first day I wore that was just that new corset was not working for me. And then
Laura was still doing farm work, dressed a little more comfortably, I would think.
Yes, I mean, it's the wonderful advice that I got from someone who did fashion shows for Civil War era clothing was, you never say never and you never say always. You don't say women always wore a corset. You can say it was incredibly common because it was the only support for what you've got. There was no over the shoulder anything. And so it was support, and the vast majority of ladies need support, don't we? And so by that logic, a lady would want that support because it's uncomfortable when you don't have it and you're doing a lot of manual labor. However, we don't know what was in every woman's wardrobe, and we don't know when she just said, I'm just going to work out in the fields today without it, and I'm going to, be uncomfortable in one way, but I'm going to be more comfortable in the other way. We don't know when that happened.
I bet people took them off a lot. Thank you so much for coming on here. This is absolutely fascinating. I hope everyone goes to the website. I hope you wind up at the Cherry Blossom Festival eventually. This is too good. And a lot of the other events I go to, I'm going to go, do you know about this? I am totally going to push this. Thank you so much for coming on. Ladies and gentlemen, there you go, the fabulous First Ladies Forum. And this is the Alison Arngrim Show, and I'm Alison Arngrim.
Love from